So thank you, Travis, for introducing me. I am Lida. I am a PhD candidate at the University of Twente, and I'm very glad to be discussing with you some of my work today. So I will be discussing about resilience and teamwork, and the information I will present is largely based on the article that Jan Martin Schagen and I published at the Human Factors Journal about resilience and team communication processes. And throughout the presentation, I will be discussing, to start with, what resilience is and how this is reflected in teamwork, and how knowledge on the communication patterns of teams can help us understand how resilient behaviors are developed, are maintained, or are depleted. And to end with, I'll focus on, let's say, some food for thought on how all this information on communication patterns and resilience can help us create better teamwork environments within our organizations or within any group that we find ourselves in. So before I go into any details on communication, let me give you a definition of team resilience, which mainly refers to being able to rebound from adversity, to figure out how to manage the situation at hand and remain adaptable no matter what the team confronts or no matter what the team members have to deal with. So a resilient team is a team that by definition is able to manage and continuously be able to handle the situation that they're faced with as the members continue to learn and work together and transform and face various environmental pressures. So in order for you to understand, I'll try to illustrate what I mean by a resilient team through a real life example. So this is a picture from the NASA mission control room in 1970, the year of the Apollo 13 mission, or as you may know it if you've watched the movie, as the incident followed by the famous line, "Houston, we've got a problem." And for those of you who don't know, Apollo 13 was scheduled to be the third land on the moon. But the mission was aborted after a problem presented itself that, if ignored, would have fatal consequences. So there you had a team in the NASA mission control room, suddenly facing an emergency that it hadn't faced before. So the team didn't really know what it was that they had to do and how to deal with the situation. But they had to figure it out, and they did. And after 6 hours from when the problem was identified, they managed to bring Apollo 13 back to a safe trajectory to Earth. So there you have it. You have a resilient team, a team that was able to break its boundaries without breaking down, and to absorb the disturbance and all the information, the new influx of information that came in front of them, and continue functioning. And there's an important point in this story I just mentioned. And this comes when you ask the question, how did they manage to do it? So the teamwork that unfolded during this crisis and the interaction processes between the team members in NASA's control room, they definitely hide information that underlies the success in adapting to the situation. And that is exactly what our research is trying to do and understand about resilience. We're looking into teams and other socio-technical systems, and we're trying to figure out what within their communication processes makes them resilient. So what types, if you may, of resilient behaviors they show. So in the Apollo 13 case, the one I just mentioned, research on the communication structure in the control room that involved analyzing the transcript of everything that was said. It showed that certain communication patterns help the team adapt to the new information. So these patterns basically acted as resilient behaviors and helped the team deal with the situation. So for example, I have here some examples of patterns. During the crisis, the structure of the communication seemed to be much more flexible. So there was much greater adaptation in the communication between the team members compared to the communication prior to the emergency. And the team showed patterns of closed loop communication throughout the crisis. So closed loop communication is a technique where usually these teams train with. Martina already mentioned some in the presentation just now. It's used to avoid misunderstandings, and it involves the sender sending some information that is repeated from the receiver and then confirmed again. Anyway, this analysis showed that members tried to maintain this pattern for as long as possible during the crisis. And this helped them in removing ambiguity and allowed questions to clarify the case. And it allowed others to be aware of the proposed course of action. However, it was obvious that while they tried to maintain the structure of communication, this was much more difficult to do during the emergency than during the normal interaction phase. The team also displayed information-seeking patterns, so they showed more variability in who they were sending information to or receiving information from. So you see some patterns that really help the team deal with this new information that they were confronted with. So this is an example of a team that successfully maintained their adaptability and showed resilience. And it gives us a lot of knowledge on trying to understand what resilience is. But knowledge on what constitutes resilience might also come from failures, from cases where the team failed to adapt. So in a research we conducted a couple of years back, we examined the communication patterns that hindered resilience and led to failure. And this research was done on the communication that preceded a plane crash on an Air France flight in 2009. And we compared the patterns that were present during the normal flight phase and how this changed when the pilots realized that they were dealing with an emergency. So there was this influx of information again, but this time the pilots failed to communicate and deal with them accordingly. And what we found is that when and how assistance is given during a crisis is crucial to maintaining adaptability. So, for example, in this case, before the emergency, there was a communication structure of constant reciprocity. And reciprocity is necessary to distribute attention, workload, time, energy among the team members. So let's say that, for instance, reciprocal patterns allow a less stressed team member, for example, to take over tasks from an overburdened team member, and expecting that in the future, the opposite will occur if the roles are reversed. And this is kind of what we saw during the normal flight phase. But during the emergency, this kind of reciprocal patterns were lost. And the communication between the pilots did not seem to have the same reciprocal attributes as it did. It became largely based on the immediately preceding piece of information that the pilots received. And this loss of reciprocity hindered the ability of the team to manage this influx of information. And it led to team resilience being lost, and unfortunately, in this case, to fatal consequences as the plane crashed. So what I have presented here are examples that might seem kind of far off when thinking of other teams, such as a team at a company meeting to discuss a strategy plan or an upcoming project. So it was more about command and control teams. But I want you to take a moment and think to yourselves, do you think that insights and communication patterns during a stressful situation can also be applied to other teams? So possibly your team, your project team, or your university team, or your department at work. And whilst we do not know yet the extent to which resilient behaviors can be applied across different teams, or the extent to which resilient behaviors differ across different types of teams, we surely know that there are always communication structures that we see during a stressful event or during a crisis that may have not emerged before or develop on the spot as adaptive mechanisms to help the team adjust to all the environmental pressures. And these patterns may be really different from the patterns that precede these crisis events. And this can be very important. So let's look at an example that can get us thinking of what we know so far and what we're yet to understand about resilient behaviors and teamwork. So I want you to think of your team for a second, either your current team at work or any situation where you've found yourself working in a team. And imagine this team having a crisis, a challenge that needs to be dealt with on the spot under, let's say, a stress of a deadline or a time pressured performance or anything that's really stressful or constitutes a crisis for you. So what would you expect? Just think about it for a second. Would it be a more centralized pattern of communication where you have a central leader who is there to allocate roles to other members and other members direct and receive communication to and from this person alone? Or would it be a more decentralized pattern of communication where some patterns of informal leadership arise and all team members start engaging in sending and receiving information? Which of the two do you think that your team would develop during a crisis? Just gonna give you a second to think about it. If you want, write it on the chat. And I'm gonna give you an answer that's based on researching surgical teams facing a crisis, which showed that a decentralized pattern of communication helps in quicker and better adaptation. And this may be related to allowing for greater distribution of information or enabling greater sharing of ideas or provision of direct feedback. And it might reflect a breakdown of the problem into chunks. So allowing every chunk of the problem to be dealt with by different members of the team in a simultaneous manner. So in the end, you have a time limit, and within this time limit, you're able to deal with different aspects of the problem simultaneously. And I asked you this particular question because when I was discussing this with some colleagues, they seem to think that having one leader and directing all communication to this leader would create more structure and remove chaos, so it would lead to better results. But we see here, or at least in the research on surgical teams, that while on the one hand, you have one leader would create a clear structure, on the other hand, it would create less flexibility. And it seems that for the surgical type of teams, during a crisis, flexibility might be more important than concrete structure. So this is an example of how this information is important in understanding, for example, how leaders should be trained to act during a crisis, or how other members are expected to act during a crisis, or maybe understand how communication should change from before the crisis to when the emergency is presented. So through this example, and of course there are many other examples like that, we see that in the end, the communication structures and patterns created may render teams more or less resilient. And this insights on communication patterns of course, when fully understood, can help us develop training or feedback systems that help these teams exercise and develop their resilient behaviors. And let me end by saying that, as we saw, changes in communication patterns show that resilience can be built and that the interactions between team members can inspire resilience. And it's thus highlights how important it is to study teams and understand teamwork and how team members work together. So that's it. And thank you very much for listening. And if you have any questions, please post them in the chat.